So moving on to World War II, go ahead and prepare a new quad chart, Unit 2. The World in Total War is what this one is about. We're going to look at really what each country did between World War I and World War II. We're going to look at the new weapons and technologies, tactics, evolutions, really the beginning of the armored warfare front, also changes in the aircraft and in the naval forces. So this essential question is, what were the initial causes of World War II in the Pacific and Europe? We'll start with Italy. Italy had a fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, and what he was really leading the country through was pledging to return Italy as its great country as it was in the past. And one of the things that he does is he tries to build a strong military and then use that military really in a manner not different than any other colonial empire, but he goes into Africa and he tries to retake a country that they'd lost in 1896, and he starts a war with Ethiopia. Successful in that, but again, not really any different than what any other country was doing in the colonial empires that we talked about leading up to World War I. Germany is really the only country that has done any evolution between World War I and World War II. And some of the things that they did is they conducted really a thorough after actions report of what they had accomplished in World War I, both in leadership and tactics, and they changed that. They developed new field manuals that were disseminated down to all of the lower ranking individuals so that everybody understood what was expected of them when they were fighting in a new war. This doctrine emphasized troop leadership, initiative, flexibility, exploitation of success on the battlefield, and it focused heavily on mechanized warfare supporting their infantry. They were really the only European army that was well suited to fight the next war. Great Britain didn't evolve or do much at all in between World War I and World War II, and this was primarily caused by political roadblocks in Parliament that really stopped them from spending any money. After all, they'd won the Great War, right? World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and they'd won that one. So they didn't think they needed to do anything to prepare for another war, even with the lead up to the Nazi takeover in Germany and Hitler's rise. France, same thing, minimal time dedicated to doing anything tactically or changing anything strategically. The Soviet Union is still an army of people, right? It doesn't have a lot of technology. It hasn't evolved tactically. In fact, the majority of any officer in the Russian army who saw evolution and wanted to change was purged by Stalin, which means he was sent out to the Gulag or they were executed. Stalin saw these people as a threat to his leadership and didn't want anything to do with them in his army. So consequently, they were really the same kind of army they had in World War I. They could throw people at combat, but they really couldn't provide anything technologically. And then finally, Japan. Japan is a very industrialized, innovative, and disciplined army, well prepared to fight. Obviously not fighting in Europe, but fighting in the Pacific. Led by really the boy emperor who has godlike status in the country, and the soldiers would fight and die for the emperor himself. And they felt such great loyalty to this man that it really caused a fanaticism in the Japanese military. Really, the guy pulling the strings behind the emperor, though, was General Tojo, and he's the one who ultimately takes the fall and responsibility for Japan's involvement in World War II. Their purpose in World War II was really expansion of the Japanese empire. I mean, they are an island with limited resources, heavily dependent on a navy, and they have no way to produce oil themselves. So they had to reach out and take resources from neighboring islands. And again, still like a colonial empire, no different than what any other country was doing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Infantry warfare really changes a lot with advancements in technology, primarily the ability to deliver them onto the battlefield and support them with armor. So evolutions in mechanized equipment allows them to quickly get around the battlefield. Evolutions in air allows paratroopers to be rapidly deployed from one location to another and really put thousands of people into a battlefield very, very quickly. But also sea forces are allowing them, like the picture here on the slide, with landing craft being able to deliver large amounts of military forces from a ship who can't get all the way into the shore. On these smaller boats, they can take them into the beaches. Motorized transport, kind of the same thing. The U.S. leads the way in this. We have a lot of automobiles in production in the United States at this point in time. So this kind of technology really enhances our ability to support troops going to war. Germany, on the other hand, has not really started to develop automobiles as much, and they're still relying heavily on horses to move things around the battlefield, at least in the initial stages. We see for the first time elite forces, special forces, being used by all military forces. We see this as a evolution of some of the specialized German forces in World War I, but primarily we see the evolution of the Waffen-SS, Army Rangers, British SAS, all shock troops that can be put on the ground and have a specific but small mission related to strategy that's impacting the greater military forces out on the ground. We also see joint operations. For the first time, air, land, and sea forces are communicating with each other and participating in an operation together. One of the things that allows this to happen is radio communications. Right? For the first time, an infantryman on the ground can coordinate either between other units. They can coordinate naval gunfire from supporting ships in the sea, or close air support from aircraft by using radio communications, something we didn't have in World War I. Also, we see squad tactics improve. Small unit tactics is what we call this, improving because of the evolution in new technology and some of the weapons that we're carrying out on the ground. The way we employ those weapons is impacted in the way that units maneuver on the ground. Obviously, one of those weapons is the BAR, the Browning automatic rifle, with every maneuver unit on the ground having the ability to put basically machine gun fire. I mean, it's not technically a machine gun because it's a single person operation. It's an automatic rifle that can put rapid amounts of ammunition into an objective and support smaller infantry units moving around. And it was really the standard that every infantry squad would have one of these. Also, the M1 Garand, a long-range 7.62 rifle that gave infantrymen a much more accurate and better rifle to use compared to what they carried in World War I. And then the next one is the Thompson submachine gun, not a long-range rifle, very good in close ranges, very good in trenches or inside of buildings, 45 caliber ammunition, so it's high capacity with that clip, but not very good as far as a long-range weapon. And this, like I said, impacted small unit tactics. So with these weapons used in conjunction together, we would see that the infantry would have a supporting element that would try to keep the enemy fixed in location, and they would use that Browning automatic rifle to do that. So you have automatic fire from your supporting element, keeping the heads down on the enemy, while your maneuvering element takes a cover and conceal route to flank through the enemy. It's something that the small unit level just didn't happen in World War I, and it was expected that this is the way men would fight in World War II. Mechanized warfare becomes highly emphasized, and it's really leading the role here in Germany with the evolution of panzer divisions. You see they have 3 divisions in 1935, 6 divisions in 1939, and then 10 full panzer divisions in 1940. And they use this armor to support their infantry in maneuver. Here we see German Panther tanks, and what's really of note is there are 5 crew members in a tank, in any one tank. And it's smaller in some of the smaller tanks the U.S. had, but primarily, if you can think of an infantry squad as being anywhere from 9 to 12 people, that's what would be maneuvering on the ground. Here you have a piece of equipment that's controlled by only 5. So you can maximize the use of the personnel that you have by putting them into the equipment that's armored and has a big main gun on it, as well as machine guns. So you could take a rather large standing army and almost double its effectiveness by putting them in tanks. And Germany was really, really good at doing that. They also had job-specific tanks like mine-clearing tanks that had blades on the front of them to push mines out of the way. They have flamethrower tanks that were full of fuel. I wouldn't want to drive one of those. But this really starts to introduce armor as a new form of warfare. This is a U.S. M4A2 Sherman tank, much smaller, smaller crew than the German tanks. Germany was really in the business of trying to build the big super tanks, super size tanks, and they never were really effective at getting those operating very good. They had a lot of mechanical problems, but a lot of the other armies had smaller tanks than that. Here we see the Russian T-34 tank. We also had half tracks, which is a vehicle. Here you see a U.S. truck, and you can tell there's wheels on the front of it, tired wheels on the front of it, but the back you can just see through there is actually a track, like on a tank. And I think this is something we learned out of World War I, as the terrain became so muddy and hard to maneuver through that a wheeled vehicle would just easily get stuck. So I think that the building of this type of truck with a tread as well as wheels on it made it much more versatile and usable in World War II in Europe. Also, rocket trucks. This is what we would call modern day as multiple launch rocket system, and they can carry these tubes can be reloaded. They can pull up and they can actually put a rocket about every meter on the ground at an objective in front of them. Very devastating weapon. And then, aside from the United States, I think that most of the nations involved in World War II really were not up to par industrially. They weren't producing the amount of weapons it was going to take to fight a vast war like World War II. And really, because of that, they couldn't replace their traditional armies. Again, the United States was way ahead in industrial production at that period of time. And an example of that is American Jeep, which is really fast, rapidly produced, put out on the battlefield, used by multiple armies. And another good example really is the Dodge truck, which a lot of people don't realize is that the Russian army actually transported its men around during World War II on United States produced Dodge trucks. Aircraft also changed, considerably between World War I and World War II. If you can think of World War I, those planes that were barely able to engage forces on the ground because of technology has rapidly changed with the ability to move faster, to carry larger payloads, to deliver paratroopers to the ground, and honestly, to impact the way that we're going to fight in the future. And, a couple of people, a British and an Italian pilot here, were really kind of forward thinking in how to use aircraft in the future. And they thought that perhaps you wouldn't even need infantry anymore. You'd be able to target civilian populations and industrial centers. And then there would be no need for men to go to war and die because we could do that all by air. They emphasized strategic bombing, strategic reconnaissance, being able to control other air forces through air defense and air defense artillery. And also, if it does come to fighting, they would use those aircraft in roles of close air support. Here's what they really were advocating for. So, psychological warfare. If you could bomb a civilian population into submission, then perhaps they would overthrow their government, and we wouldn't have to go in and fight there. And you can see that it's exactly what they tried to do. 650,000 civilian casualties in World War II in Europe. Well-armed B-17s, Americans, as we get later on into the war, pushing through German defenses, supported by P-51 Mustangs. I'll have a couple of pictures of those up in a second. And then also dropping a sheer amount of ordnance on top of Europe like we did, 2.6 million tons of bombs dropped on Europe. Primarily that's, hitting into Germany. Now, even though these two pilots were advocating bombing civilian targets, the United States Congress would not allow U.S. pilots to do that. We focused our targeting on industrial centers. So things like Germany's ability to produce weapons of war, rail yards, things of infrastructure. Those were the types of targets that the United States was focusing on, even though some of the European armies we were fighting with was focusing on the civilian population. Here's that United States B-17. There's actually one of these out at the Colorado Springs Airport. It's a privately owned aircraft. And if you go view the World War II Aviation Museum out there, sometimes they'll take you into that hangar and let you see that. I took some kids last year from this class, actually, over there to visit that one day. US P-51 support aircraft for bombers flying forward. British really innovative in developing radar, and radar in the ability to identify incoming aircraft, scramble their fighters, and then intercept those aircraft over the English Channel, often before they would ever get into Britain. Another thing that they did, and we'll talk about this a little bit in another lesson, but they relocated a lot of their tools of war to places where the German bombers were out of range of reaching, even if the radar would have failed. Here's a British Royal Air Force Spitfire aircraft. And then the German Luftwaffe, really, Germany was still forcing everything on their army. So the German Air Forces, the Luftwaffe, was designed in support of the army. So they really initially didn't envision themselves as building these super bombers and trying to bomb other people, but they were trying to support their troops out on the ground. And here's a Mitsubishi Zero aircraft from the Japanese. A lot of people don't know that the automobile manufacturer Mitsubishi is who really made the majority of the Japanese aircraft for World War II. And another slower moving aircraft of the Luftwaffe. This is a Luftwaffe Junker aircraft. Naval warfare also changes. There's still a big submarine threat, but the British believe that because they've developed radar and in the use in the Navy sonar, that they'd be able to easily identify all these submarines under the water and sink them before they would be a threat to their Navy or to anything else. And it just proves not to be the case. I think they underestimated the ability of the German Navy to evolve and still produce some pretty damaging submarines, which is exactly what they did. German U-boats were used as a defensive force, which is probably a mistake. Had they launched them out further away from the mainland, instead of just putting up kind of a blockade and sinking ships, if they'd have put the wolf packs into an offensive role, actually hunting the other navies, they probably would have been a lot more effective and a lot harder to detect as they're spread out throughout the ocean. But still, they sunk 30 ships for every one of their U-boats that were sunk by 1942. And if you look at the casualties, 36,000 sailors killed, 3,500 merchant vessels sunk, and 175 warships. That's where they really made their errors. They didn't go out and search specifically of the warships. They were just trying to stop supplies from coming in, same way they did in World War I. And they lost 783 U-boats. In the Pacific theater, considerably different type of warfare happening than in the European theater when it comes to the navies. Really concentrated American fleets going against the Japanese fleets in the Pacific. And this war, the Japanese thought was going to be centered on battleships. So they built these big, massive battleships, and they thought that they would fight side by side and try to sink ships, and that's how they would win and defeat the Americans in the Pacific. The battleships the Americans used were really used in a support role for marine landings and that as we started island hopping across the South Pacific. And the reason of that is because of the development of the aircraft carrier. So we use the aircraft carrier as the primary weapon in the Pacific for the Navy, and which gave us a lot of standoff. So instead of having our battleships just go straight into combat with another Navy, we used recon aircraft to fly off these aircraft carriers, and then they would find, locate, and then destroy other ships. And then Japan started evolving to do the same thing, but they were really heavily focused on battleships, which put them at a disadvantage from the very beginning in World War II in the Pacific.